Thank you for tuning into the podcast. Today I had Mike Fave on. Mike's an independent researcher as well as a nurse, so he has good experience with helping people directly, but then also he's a coach now, and he follows the Bioenergetic framework, and his podcast, along with Jay Feldman, his co-host, have really helped me to just understand more about like what's actually going on, I guess, with biology and like physiology in general. And that's just like led me to just like improve my health like beyond measures that I could ever like say before. Knowing like how certain foods kind of like affect your stress levels and stuff was never something I understood. They explained it and then it made a lot more sense about like, oh, well, I eat this food and I feel a certain way, and it just made a lot more sense. So I really recommend their podcast, the Energy Balance Podcast. I really dove deep with Mike here, probably like the deepest I've ever gone on a podcast. I think this one will be helpful just to understand more about like the physiology behind it and like kind of get like a more of like an in-depth view than just like the baseline level of like bro science. So listen to this one and I hope you guys enjoy. All right, thanks, Mike, for coming on the podcast. See you in the nice background here in Costa Rica.
Yeah, pleasure to be here. I appreciate the invitation.
Of course. I just listened to your podcast with Saladino, and I don't know. I think it's good that the word is getting out about like bioenergetics because so many people are like kind of struggling. And I don't know, the more that I get into it, it's just like I could see it in the people around me. I don't know if you've kind of felt that for a while now that you've kind of been in this for a good amount of time.
Yeah, I think there's a normal transition that people move through with this type of stuff. So first is kind of you're on a standard American diet, you have some health problems, you go to the doctor, or even you're like, I don't want to go to the doctor. And you start to figure out, oh, if I change my diet or if I eat healthier, whatever, I don't have to take this pharma. And you go on the traditional healthy diet. And then from there, you get introduced to all these rabbit holes, right? So you have vegan, you have vegetarian, you have carnivore, you have keto, you have low carb. And then you kind of run through a couple of those. And then it tends to seem that bioenergetic kind of is this like last stop for a lot of people where it introduces some interesting dietary concepts outside of just like stay away from carbs or plant foods are bad or animal foods are bad. It's like a more, I guess, complete perspective. So yeah, I've seen this with tons of clients. It was a similar transition that I've seen for myself. And then I think this fear is starting to pick up because you're seeing big names who went through the same thing, right? So you're seeing that with Paul Saladino, you're seeing that with Dr. Mercola, and you're also seeing people who are slowly shifting over. I think like Thomas DeLauer will probably be one of the next ones. So yeah, there's definitely been a shift in interest to this. I think because there is problems with each of those other dietary iterations that people are doing, and this kind of starts to answer some of those problems.
I think a good place to start is kind of just like, I think fasting in general, because it's like the first like actionable step in the day. I know for a while it was just like, wake up, black coffee, run, lift, and then try to not eat because that was reducing the amount of calories I would consume.
Yeah.
So I guess just in general with like fasting and like what actually happens on the biological level when, you don't have enough fuel. So you have to, some people start to say like, oh, my hunger started to go away. And, now I'm feeling more focused. So what exactly is happening like biologically during that moment?
Yeah. So I think a good place to start with this is you had a huge proponent of fasting, Dr. Peter Attia, who was talking about how he did fasting for 10 years, all different varieties of fasting, intermittent fasting, some like 24-hour fast to 72-hour fast. And then at the end of this 10-year time frame, he's like, I actually lost lean tissue. I lost muscle mass. And so the reason I think that's a good starting place is to just give us an indication of what's going on with fasting. So you're basically not taking in exogenous energy sources. So carbs and fats, and then also protein, which is a building block for body tissues. And then you're relying on your body's own endogenous sources or stores of these different components like carbs and fats, right? So you're going to break down glycogen. You're going to start to increase fatty acid oxidation. And then the other thing, depending on how long the fasts go, is in order to like maintain this, because especially when you start to get leaner, you start shredding a lot of this storage tissue. Then you start to have some effects on metabolic function and hormonal function where you start to see the body saying like, look, we can't really push metabolic rate up higher because we're shredding through our stores. We need to reserve this type of stuff. So I think as a general framework, that's kind of what you're seeing with fasting is driving stress to because you're like not taking in the adequate amount of energy sources that you need in general. And then there's some reductionistic pathways that they talk about with, keeping protein intake lower with the fast as well, and insulin signaling lower, so you can lower mTOR signaling, which supposedly has a benefit for lifespan in different animal models. But some of the caloric restriction studies in animals, especially when you compare like rats to monkeys, the effects are start to change, right? So like if you fast or you calorically restrict, because the fasting they're even talking about now, that the benefits of fasting may be like similar to caloric restriction and just make caloric restriction easier. There's been some arguments around that. But when you start looking at animal models, if you restrict intake or energy sources in animals like mice, you can see some longevity benefits. Again, these are on like the most terrible lab diets that you can conceive of. And then when you have monkeys, if you start restricting calories, even for like young animals, you actually get worse outcomes for their longevity, even though some health markers improve to some extent. So they actually had shortened lifespans and decreased growth rates. And so just like looking at types of animals, right? Like the mice or the rats are like a lower complexity species compared to a primate. And you're seeing as you're kind of going up, you start to increase the caloric restriction in like these younger animals, you're getting problems. So then to make the jump into humans, I think you may also see some other problems. And I think we see this with people where when they start to fast, over time, they start to develop problems with stress, problems with hormonal function, loss of lean mass or an ability to maintain lean mass, and then changes in mood and a variety of other problems. So I think the fasting is like you're essentially driving stress by limiting your intake, and it just allowing you to limit your intake by limiting the eating windows, right? If you don't eat for an entire day, you just lost, like if you average it over across the week, that's 2,000 calories, assuming a 2,000 calorie diet that you lost for that week time frame. Or intermittent fasting just makes it hard to actually eat an adequate amount of food inside this like 8-hour or 10-hour fasting window, depending on whether you're a man or a woman.
I think too, it's important to kind of distinguish what you want, because like normally people are just, they want to lose weight, but it's normally the body fat that they actually want to lose.
Yeah.
So then when you think about it, it's like, okay, I need to get my metabolic rate so that I'm not eating nothing, but then also not shredding body fat. So like when you look at it from that perspective, it's like, the hormones are so important. And I don't know, do you kind of see it that way? It's just like the stress mitigation, and then obviously like putting stuff into your system that's going to help, because I don't know, just for so long, it was like not about what I was actually putting in. It was more so just let me like put the numbers down on the scale. Like what's like the first thing you look at kind of for someone who's like, I want to lose fat. Like what do I need to do?
Yeah. So I think there's two major camps. So it's like the foods that you choose will make the difference for your weight. And then you have the calories in, calories out, and if it fits your macros people. And I think both camps actually have some degree of delusion. So I think total energy intake is important. So understanding what your actual caloric needs are important. I think regardless of the idea that you can just keep eating more and metabolism will increase, that I don't think that that's a reality. I think there's actually you will start to gain weight at a certain if you're in a surplus to a large extent. So, but it's not necessarily about just creating a massive deficit either, because you need to understand that there's ramifications from that. So for the people who are sitting there like, oh, it just matters what food I'm eating. It's like, yeah, the amount of food also is an important piece. And on the flip side, you have the calories in, calories out. If it fits your macros people, it's like, I can basically just eat garbage. And as long as I don't eat a lot of garbage, I won't get fat. And it's like, no, the different foods actually have different effects on metabolism and then on fat accretion and things like this. Again, a very extreme example, but 2,000 calories worth of alcohol, like vodka, versus 2,000 calories of steak is going to drastically change the like fatty acid composition and amount in something like the liver. And if you start to impair metabolic function directly at the liver, then you can start to see issues with insulin sensitivity and whatnot, and put you in a state that actually be easier to accrue body fat. So when I start to dial something in with a client, I'm looking at what's their actual total energy requirement based on their activity level, their lean body mass, because that's the most metabolically active tissue. And then I'm also dialing in specific foods, right? Because if you're eating foods that your body's not tolerating, creating an inflammatory response, or you also have issues going on in the microbiome, and then you're leaking metabolic toxins like endotoxin into the system, then that can also directly interfere with metabolic processes and also hormonal regulation, which will shift. Are you actually losing fat mass, and are you accruing lean tissue? Or are you holding more water, or are you gaining more fat tissue because of changes in things like glucocorticoid signaling, insulin sensitivity, and whatnot? So there's a multiple factors to look at, and I guess it's more marketable to say, oh, just you can eat whatever you want as long as you dial in calories. Like maybe in the short term, sure, but in the long term, I think the most complete and effective strategy is to look at total energy intake, make sure that's appropriate for what the person requires. And then if you're going to create any degree of deficit, make sure that it's actually done appropriately. It's not too heavy where you're just smashing somebody's metabolism down. It's kind of like walking on a tight wire a little bit. And then make sure the food sources that are being used are dialed in effectively as well. So that you're not damaging metabolism through like toxic components like polyunsaturated fatty acids or microbiome disruption or heavy metals, or basically just pure garbage food that doesn't have any nutrient density.
I've heard people talk about fasting too, like with autophagy, but isn't that kind of the same thing that would happen if you were just in a healthy state, essentially like cleaning up whatever cells are damaged or whatnot? And wouldn't that be better or can you just like touch on like the differences between like the carb and the fat metabolism? That might be too many questions, but
yeah, I think those are two separate things, like the question of autophagy and then the question of carb versus fat metabolism. So which would be like stress versus non-stress to some extent. So with the autophagy stuff, there's a couple things that are important to keep in mind. And one of those things is, why is autophagy happening? So, or another example with hormesis stuff is like, if you're doing like really hot saunas and you're inducing heat shock proteins, it's like similar to this autophagy idea. It's like, why are we triggering heat shock proteins? It's like when we expose our body to really high temps, or we expose our body to like a lack of substrate coming in, like amino acids to build components or energy substrate, then our body is going to have to cannibalize itself to actually provide the substrate that we need. So you're inducing autophagy and you're inducing the breakdown of these cellular structures. And I think a large portion of that is to actually provide substrate in this circumstance where you don't have the exogenous substrate. And whereas example with like the heat shock protein element, it's like you're putting your body under an extreme heat stress. You're likely denaturing some proteins depending on the temperatures that you're reaching. And then that's triggering a heat shock protein to be like, okay, we need to go and repair these proteins that we just damaged. And so maybe there's an off-target benefit to that, but you are inducing damage to have an effect, which is arguably problematic in the long run, especially when you consider that the stress has a cumulative effect. So it's not like a single bout effect. It's like if you keep exposing yourself to different stressors, there can be a cumulative element to it. At the end of the day, I think we can all agree that you need to actually have energy substrate coming in. So there's a level where it's like there's an appropriate amount of energy substrate to optimize our function and for our particular goals. And we want to make sure that we're hitting that. And I think in the hormetic spheres and fasting spheres and some of these other areas, I think a assumption by many people there is that more is better. So the more is better fallacy is what people kind of run with. And then they get really extreme with it and they start fasting more and more because they just assume that more is better, instead of understanding like, well, maybe there's actually detriment to some of these things that cumulatively will outweigh the actual benefits. Mm-hmm. So the reason I brought up heat shock with the fasting is because hormetic mechanisms like autophagy or the increase in heat shock protein, or for example, another example would be increasing NRF2 and like NRF2 and sirtuin signaling under different substances that would trigger an oxidative stress inside mitochondria, or like a poison response, and then upregulate the antioxidant enzymes. Those types of ideas, you have to first consider context and be like, am I damaging myself first to get this response? and really understand that mechanism, because it's a slippery slope with that ideas, right? That's why you see people start to say, oh, radiation's good because it's hormetic. It's like, I don't know about that one.
I think Jay does such a good job, your podcast co-host, just about kind of like talking about that in his articles.
Yeah, the articles are great for that type of stuff.
One of the articles about, I guess, the carbon fat metabolism I was looking at, I just thought it was so interesting because before I didn't really know anything about like the difference in like the biochemistry of like metabolism, which most people don't. But I think it's important to touch on the fact that like fat metabolism is like similar to these other, metabolisms that we don't want to mirror. So kind of like, diabetes or whatever else. So I don't know, like exactly like how did that become like fat burning is like the healthy thing to do?
Yeah, I think, I don't know exactly the specific journey it took where fat burning just became the pinnacle of health, or even the idea that if you're burning mostly fats, you're metabolically flexible, because it's actually completely the opposite. I don't know who came up with that idea and has promoted it, but it essentially, I would guess it came around this idea of fat loss. And then it kind of maybe grew with this obesity epidemic inside Western nations. So this idea that excess body fat is associated with all of these different problems. So if we're actually increasing our fat burning, we can minimize the amount of body fat we have. And then since less body fat or leanness is associated with health, then I guess there's like a conflation that those things are beneficial. And instead of understanding that in most disease states and in most metabolic dysfunction states, the major source of energy is fatty acid metabolism, particularly in insulin resistance and metabolic syndrome type situations. And the carb oxidation that starts to be prioritized is mostly running carbohydrates through things like glycolysis, instead of actually bringing them from the glycolytic chain into the or what they call non-oxidative glycolysis. But so bringing carbohydrates from the glycolytic process into the mitochondria to through the Krebs cycle into the electron transport chain to actually produce a larger amount of ATP per unit of glucose. So you're essentially stuck in this kind of like shunting pathway where you're just moving your carbohydrates through through this glycolysis, and the carbs are not being converted into that ATP effectively or to so efficiently through the oxidative metabolism. And you're forced into, or you're relying heavily on fatty acid oxidation. And so when you look in the diabetes research, or you look in insulin resistance or obesity or whatnot, you see like, oh, wow, there's actually this excess of fatty acid metabolism going on. And then even in cancer, you're seeing there's some interesting papers coming out talking about there's a weird fatty acid oxidation going on in cancer cells. And then the Warburg effect, where you're running glycolysis even in the presence of oxygen. So the oxidative glycolysis, you're basically seeing that the oxidative glycolysis and lactic acid fermentation, the lactate production, is causing, or is not being used as an energy substrate, but is being more used as a way to produce different metabolites for the cancer cells' metabolism and anabolic processes. And so you start to see, oh, wow, in all these disease processes, in diabetes, insulin resistance, obesity, heart disease, heart failure, coronary artery disease, and cancer, that you're seeing this drastic upregulation in fatty acid oxidation. And when you start looking at fatty acid oxidation, you start to see this issue with reductive stress. So a buildup of things like NADH over NAD plus. And then you start to be like, whoa, there's actually we shouldn't be prioritizing this, And then now you have the hormesis guys are talking about, oh, we need to increase our NAD and we need to activate all these salvage pathways to increase our NAD levels, but then promoting low carb diets. And then it's just like, you could just oxidize carbs effectively, and that would maintain an adequate NAD to NADH ratio, and you wouldn't have to worry about all these crazy salvage pathways and these expensive niacin forms like nicotinamide riboside or nicotinamide mononucleotide. And you can use something like just niacin or niacinamide and with adequate carb oxidation to make sure that you don't actually build up reductive stress. And then also the marker for this reductive stress, the NAD to NADH ratio is also basically indicating what's going on in terms of fatty acid versus carb oxidation. I know I talked about kind of a lot of pieces there,
Yeah.
but to your point, it's like there's all these states are characterized by fatty acid oxidation and being shifted towards fatty acid oxidation, stuck towards that fatty acid oxidation, and then actually having problems with the glucose oxidation. And you're like moving towards that and pushing that and prioritizing that doesn't actually create this metabolic flexibility or health. And it doesn't even help with the weight loss because you have a change also in the rate of fat accrual as well. So there's like a lot of elements to look at to see, is it just about burning fats, or is it about like storing fats? Is it about like what's going on with all the other substrates simultaneously and their conversion into different storage forms, whether they're fat or glycogen, et cetera? And then starting to see, what's actually driving this, what's the hormonal milieu. And so there's multiple layers of regulation. And when you start to this is why Dr. Peat's work is so helpful, is because he gives you this big system to work with and a lens to view stuff. And then you start to see, oh, wow, like these things actually make sense out of just some basic reductionistic pathway. And I think the reductionistic pathways is also part of this idea, or pushing these ideas of the fatty acid oxidation element.
Mm-hmm. I also appreciate like the kind of, the feelings that you feel like tied to the emotions that Pete talks about. Kind of like, if you do certain things in your environment, you might have a higher serotonin level, which is then going to affect your gut and have all these other kind of issues. So it kind of made sense when I was like, oh, well, if I'm fasting and I'm not eating carbs, like my stress is going to go up. And that then when I did try to eat carbs, I wanted to eat so much. So I think it's like kind of important to just talk about with bioenergetics, how in general, it's like the way that we would have lived kind of not like ancestrally, like thousands of years ago, but just like a few hundred years ago when people are outside, like, eating like sugar and coffee and, red meat and stuff. It's like, most people don't want to be like the David Goggins in Stream. They just want to live their life and be happy. But people get like confused into thinking that they want to do the extreme things. So I appreciate you guys like kind of talking about that on your podcast. And I know it's kind of like a transition you have to make from going from these extreme things into the, it's really just live life, but we need to eat certain foods that are going to help us get there.
Yeah, I think when you read Dr. Peat's work, at least for me, there's a sense of possibility and opportunity and growth and development and kind of like what is the best possible outcome and option versus at least that's the feeling, that's the philosophical feeling of his work, at least physiologically, right? There's different areas that he talks about. But when you start to read like the hormesis stuff, it's this feeling of like, oh, what is this like new, interesting reductionistic pathway that I can hack? And there's no overarching system. And it's like, you're like trying to do this thing for this thing here and this thing for that thing there and that thing for that thing over here. And it's like this discombobulated system of ideas that doesn't have any underlying like weaving element through it. And it gets super complex and it seems like it's cutting edge, but it's almost if you actually have some overarching system to look at these other perspectives, like through an actual like a unified lens, then it's like, wow, this stuff is like, this doesn't make sense. And this is, there's some problems here. And where you read at Pete's stuff is like, are there some implementation elements that may or may not work for people with like the way Peat set up his specific diet? Sure. But like the idea behind Pete's work wasn't to just copy whatever diet he was sharing in the Ask Your Herb Doctor podcast or whatever. It's like, there's a series of principles and there's a quilt of unifying information that had been stitched together that for which you can understand these different components and like have some direction for your own growth and your development and understanding of, or try to get an understanding of like how life works and purpose behind things. Whereas I think the hormetic stuff falls into this kind of sphere of like discrete random particles and chaos and entropy and things like this. And Peat stuff is this idea of like construction, a belief in purposeness or purposefulness. And so like for me, when I was reading his papers, they were compared to what I was getting in college, it was a massive difference. And it was like there was a enlightening effect for me and a mind opening effect and an expansive effect, kind of like, you know, the image that he puts with his content, like the William Blake image where the guy is like in this expanded posture, whereas the the biohacking and the hormesis and the restrictive diets are like seem antithetical to that to a large extent. And then when you, again, if you have the overarching lens from Pete's work, then you start to see why things are that way and like what the problem is with some of those components.
I enjoy it too, just as like focus on the thyroid and kind of to get back to like the stress stuff. It's like, that's why you focus so much on the thyroid, was because that was going to, you know, make you be more resistant to stress. So how exactly does that work? Because I never knew about thyroid. And then now it's just like everything like is filtered through the lens of like, oh, like, you know, that person might not be eating. So that's why they, you know, when they do eat, they have to eat too much, or I don't know. It's just like everything filtered through the lens of that. So, you know, I don't know, like, how do you start with someone who doesn't know anything about thyroid and just like why it's so important? Because so many people want the testosterone, they want the mood, and they don't realize that like it starts with thyroid.
Yeah. So it's, again, that's like piecemealing things instead of having some overarching perspective to view things through or a unified lens. And so when you think about, if you go all the way down to the cellular process and you think about what's required for cells to actually function effectively, you start to see that energy is central to almost every single cellular function. Are there some processes that, you know, like a diffusion across the membrane that's not energy dependent? Like, do some of those things happen? Sure. But the vast majority of really important cell processes are actually energy dependent. You see different substrate like ATP or NADPH or NADH all required for these different enzymatic processes for the cell to actually function appropriately. So you get this general idea that energy is absolutely essential. And then when you start to look at cell death processes, it's like disruption of mitochondrial function and an opening of the mitochondrial transition pore and a release of cytochrome C oxidase is triggering cell death. And it's like, yeah, because you just lost energy. It's like the cell doesn't have this extremely important, it's like a currency in the economy of life to function on a regular basis. And so like the cell is like, all right, that's it. We throw in the towel. And that's where you see apoptosis. And it's basically that's like a salvaging process where the cells breaking down these constituents, and other cells and tissues would be able to possibly harness and use them. So you see how central the energy piece is. And so when you look at that at the cellular level, and then you extrapolate that out into like a more whole organism level, then you start to understand that the hormonal systems are an overlaying process on the whole organism. Then you start to see, okay, well, thyroid is extremely essential because it actually is this master regulating element on mitochondrial function and mitochondrial dynamics. And the mitochondria are actually the central nuclear powerhouses, you could say, of the cell. And so that's where I think, you know, Pete, he like seeing this value of energy. And then he's like going back to thyroid and being like, oh, wow, thyroid is controlling the energy processes. And then you kind of can work around from there. So you start with this central principle or tenet, and then you kind of work back and see how that picture is flowing. And then from there, you also see the stress dynamics. So you can see that in the stress state, if you view it as an energy supply versus energy demand issue, you start to see if I don't have enough exogenous substrate, energy substrate, carbs, fats, etc., coming in, then I start to raise these stress hormones. If I don't have enough of these resources like calcium or sodium, then I start to raise these stress hormones like parathyroid hormone or aldosterone. And so then the system becomes, if I supply these adequate resources on a consistent basis, and then I can actually lower these stress hormone systems and then also optimize metabolic function to some extent, because you don't have to actually degrade your tissue or degrade your body's own structure. And so you start to you have the energy is absolutely essential. And then you have these hormonal systems overlaying that are basically saying like what's going on with energy supply in terms of like ATP production, and then also like substrate availability in the terms of carbs, fats, and then also the nutrients. So that with this energy as the central piece, you can start to unify everything together instead of having these individual elements that are completely disjointed and not connected, and it's like looking at them under the microscope instead of having the overarching picture of that. So I think that's why Dr. Peat and in the bioenergetic perspective, thyroid was so central, is because of this focus and understanding of the value of energy and thyroid actually controlling energy. And then this is also why there's it seems black and white. It's not necessarily black and white. There's nuance, but there's this whole idea about these other hormones being stressful, or the stress hormones actually being a negative thing that we don't want to prioritize, like adrenaline, cortisol, aldosterone, serotonin, et cetera, because of their effects on energy metabolism and what they're signaling about the organism's state.
Yeah. I mean, it's really fascinating because it's like, once you realize, like, well, if I'm not supplying the fuel, like it's coming from somewhere, so it's got to come like off my body. So I mean, that's like the whole thing with like the glucose being stored in the liver and all that. So can you kind of touch on that? Because I think that's interesting that, I never really thought about liver health, and then my liver enzymes were elevated. So I was like, shoot, like something's going on here. And I know that's normally like, I mean, you guys have done like tons of episodes about that, but just like the fatty liver thing is just so common. And, what we're eating is just going to kind of contributing to it at this point.
Yeah. So that's actually a great question and a great point. And I think the digestive system, that ties directly in with the liver, which is why I'm kind of starting there. The digestive system is one of the biggest monkey wrenches in this entire process. And that's because the metabolites that get produced from some of the bacterial fermentation in the gut, and then also some of the hormone that are released from the gut, like serotonin, like histamine, like substance P, have such a profound negative effect on metabolism and hormonal function, and also immune regulation, that also like directly taps the liver, because the liver gets all of the blood supply from the gut to a large extent. So if anything's happening in the gut, it's gonna smash your liver first. Your liver kind of is this like first barrier of defense. And so if there's problems in the gut, there's likely problems at the liver, and then then that can like directly damage metabolism, even if you're bringing in all of these good food sources and adequate carbs and protein and fat and vitamins and minerals. It's like you're basically dropping this food in there. And then if the microbiome is pretty toxic or the gut is pretty inflamed, then you get all these weird effects despite having the best diet ever. And so that has to be troubleshooted. And that's one of the big areas that people, I think, have a difficult time dialing in, even though they get some of these other areas right. And it also takes some time. And so that liver is the liver is that first layer of defense to that type of stuff. And, the liver is also heavily involved in the activation of thyroid hormone from inactive T4 to active T3. It's involved in regulating blood glucose metabolism, which is absolutely essential for almost all metabolic processes. So if those things, if the liver's taxed, then you get a decrement in all of these different functions. And that becomes highly problematic for metabolism, because this like main, I guess, like regulating system starts to get pretty damaged or pretty impaired. And then you start to see loss of all these other functions.
And like with the gut too, it's like you said, like you could be digesting the best diet ever, but if you have like, IBS or like some sort of like, I don't really know how they start, but they just happen, and then you're not digesting the food properly. So it's like you could have the most dialed diet, but it doesn't even matter because you're not getting any of the nutrients. And then once okay, well, the nutrients, it's not just that I need the protein, but like there's certain like, cofactors for the metabolic processes. Then you realize, okay, like I need these nutrients to help me function better. So it makes a lot of sense once I got into that, because I was like starting to eat like more like nutrient dense diet and stuff. People say that, but they don't actually explain, okay, well, what is the thing going to? They kind of just like, oh, we'll just eat liver because Liver King said to eat it. It's like, no, we're going to eat it because it has certain vitamin that's going to kind of go down the process or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the other thing that you're seeing is that people are starting to the idea of vitamins and minerals is not a new concept. And then being cofactors for metabolic processes is essential. These have been developing over the whole course of the 19th century, right? And even I think some of the 1800s as well. So there's all this, there's a variety of information coming from there. But I think in the popular dietary spheres, the idea of nutrients being absolutely essential really picked up or is picking up in different areas. Then you're getting these weird outcroppings now of like, well, this nutrient's toxic and that nutrient's toxic, and we need to have really high amounts of these other ones. And I think that that's also problematic because you start to find that, well, I think for a lot of these nutrient compounds, vitamins and minerals, there is an optimal amount for an individual, and it's more about figuring out what the optimal amount is for that individual's context. And that's the same thing with calories and macros, like protein, carbs, and fats. And in food sources, instead of like trying to have this like one amount that just applies to every single person, I don't think that actually is a reality. You know, I had a lot of people coming off carnivore, they have iron overload, and then it's like, you know, in that circumstance, getting rid of some, like donating some blood can be quite helpful. They didn't have a high calcium intake, so recovering their calcium intake and lowering that phosphorus level and also that PTH hormone will be important. But then on the flip side, you know, I have women that I work with that come from these plant-based vegan, vegetarian backgrounds, and they're extremely anemic. So having them go on like blood donation regimens because iron is super toxic, it's actually a really terrible idea. And then on the flip side, if you have somebody coming from a plant-based background and they're pretty low on fat soluble vitamins, the idea that like vitamin A is just this super toxin for those people actually is extremely problematic. They probably should actually have an adequate amount of vitamin A, an adequate amount of different fat soluble vitamins like vitamin D and vitamin K, particularly vitamin K2, because they probably were deficient on the diet that they had unless they were taking steps to supplement or balance it effectively. And that's especially the case if they're on like a grain-based, plant-based vegetarian diet, right? You know, you're not going to have higher amounts of beta carotene intake, which again, it doesn't convert well to vitamin A, but it still like prevent or some of the problematic elements. So it's like taking an individual's context into consideration, which was also a huge tenet of Peat's work, which is why these ideas around like there's an actual Peat diet that everybody should follow it's kind of funny because, you know, Peat mentions these things and it's like, these are things that people ask him on a podcast, is like, what's a good diet? And Peat had no context for what this person was doing. So he just gave them, you know, milk and orange juice, which are like, they're cheap, or they were cheap in the US at one point, and they're super energy dense and they don't require any prep time. So it's like, from a theoretical perspective, there's a lot of benefits to them, but it's like, do you tolerate them digestively? What's your metabolic state? Like, can you handle a ton of rapidly digesting carbs very fast? Or like, do you need to have some slower digesting options because you have some some compromise in your metabolic function? And so how can he answer those questions on a podcast with somebody asking him, you know, what should I eat? It's just like, all right, here's some general ideas to start with. I think all of us run into that. Even Jay and I will run into that. People ask us like, you know, what should I do? And it's like, well, tell me a little bit more about yourself before, you know, you got to wine and dine me a little bit before I can give you some specific directions, because I need to know what your context is. And so those things become really important. So context is important. And then also understanding that there's a appropriate amount of things for things to optimally function. Some things you can get like a way higher amount can be beneficial, whereas some things a super high amount can actually start to become problematic. And so there's a lot of nuance in those areas as well. And I think we're seeing dietary wars move into that, especially in some of these niche things that are popping up. So I did want to address that as well, just briefly.
Yeah. That's why I think it's so empowering though with the bioenergetics, because it's like at first I was like pumping like, I don't know, orange juice and too many carbs and it wasn't working. So like I kind of cut it back. So it's like, you know, if you're coming from a low carb place, you're obviously not going to be able to digest carbs as well as someone who's been eating them. And I think kind of to tie back to like maybe a little bit to like insulin sensitivity and just like carbs, like being able to utilize carbs in general, because people like say, you know, carbs are bad. And it's like, first we need to talk about like what kind of carbs we're talking about. And then second, is it the carb or just like some sort of issue with digestion? And, you know, it's probably that, but I don't know. It's just interesting to see that like one person can thrive on a certain diet and the other person just, if they try the exact same diet, they might really suffer with issues. So I'm sure that makes it like a lot harder with like coaching people, but it also is empowering to the person because it's like, oh, this food didn't work. Let me try a different one. Kind of, there's more options than just meat or more meat or a different kind of meat.
Yeah, that's I think, and again, the context stuff becomes important. I actually, at the moment, in the process of finishing building out a course that helps people with weight loss in the bioenergetic sphere and also helps them transition from low carb, because those are two big problems that a lot of my client base is dealing with. And a lot of there's like some basic or not even basic, but there's some specific things that are applicable across the board for a lot of people dealing with these issues, that if they got those principles right, they'd be able to get like pretty rapid success in transitioning from low carb or managing their weight effectively with a bioenergetic framework and having carbs in their diet. But the important thing to understand with this stuff is like when you're in a low carb state, you have a certain context. And so you're not going to be, you may have a hard time smashing rapidly digesting carbs coming out of a low carb state. There's a transition period where metabolism adjusts, hormones adjust, microbiome adjusts. And so there's a way to actually troubleshoot through that instead of just kind of like fumbling through it and then saying carbs are the problem. It's like, well, you're in a entirely different state. I mean, I fumbled through it personally. I was like, tried all types of stuff, gave myself a ton of problems when I tried to transition away.
Was that with the milk?
From low carb? What was that?
Was that like related to milk and trying to?
It was milk. It was starch. It was using tons of refined carbohydrate sources. Like I tried to skin the cat in like 1,000 ways with different carb sources until I kind of settle what works. And it took me a little while because there's also that interindividuality component where different people will respond to different things differently. So I don't really do that well with starches. I do quite well with sugars, but for me, every time I have starch, I get a little sleepy, I get a little brain foggy, my cognition's not as good. But if I have sugars from fruits and juice and dried fruits and things like this, then I'm pretty consistent throughout the day. And the only way I was going to figure that out was test that out. Because I also have clients who don't do that well with sugars, but they do way better with starches. And so that's a process of individual experimentation, which again is another bioenergetic principle that people gloss over. Context and experimentation, understanding principles, and then building things out from that. The perceive, think, act framework. People are just like, oh, I did milk and orange juice and that didn't work for me, so bioenergetic must be bunk. And it's like, yeah, that's not really bioenergetic. That's the cliche interpretation of bioenergetic from a dietary sphere perspective, because most of the dietary spheres are stuck arguing about relatively trivial components because they don't there's no nuance or context. And that's kind of what you're pointing out, right? It's like if things aren't working for you on carnivore, you just need to eat more steak. Like you're just not eating enough steak, or you're not having enough beef tallow. And it's like there's probably more to the picture. Or if somebody's not doing well on like a vegan or vegetarian diet, it's like, yeah, you're just eating, you need to go raw. You just need raw food. And it's like doubling down on these areas instead of saying, okay, what principle am I dialing in on? Am I just honing down on the fact that all animal foods are toxic, and so I need to get like more and more plant foods in like a more raw state? Or with carnivore, all plant foods are toxic, so I just need to get more animal foods. It's like you're dialing in on a singular principle, taking it to an extreme, and I don't even think that it's it's not effective, because there's more variables to consider in the overall picture than just this one element. Now, again, I'm not here to say that, plant-based and vegan diets or carnivore diets or keto or fasting doesn't have benefits for people. Because if you're coming from a crappy standard American diet and you make changes in these directions, there are definitive benefits for a lot of people coming from these spheres. It's just, I don't think that they're a final solution, because there's quite a few problems in the premise of these different diets. And so it's like, if you're fasting and you have gut problems, yeah, you're going to feel better. Like George St. Pierre was having, I think he got like ulcerative colitis and he started fasting. He's like, wow, intermittent fasting, I felt way better. And it's like, of course you're going to feel better. If you have ulcerative colitis, you have irritation to the colon, and you have severe dysbiosis, of course, not eating is going to improve your symptoms, because you're actually not irritating that area. And you're giving digestive system like kind of like a rest from the process of digesting food, a rest, and you can lower the endotoxin load. So it's like, in that circumstance, yes, you're going to feel a benefit. And, especially if your diet was, standard American diet or plant-based, and it was like all tons of grains and beans and nuts and seeds and like 12 grain bread and all this stuff, and you're always bloated all the time and constipated and whatnot. And it's like, oh, I go to a 0 fiber diet, carnivore, and I fast, and it's like, my digestion is so much better. It's like, yes, of course it's going to be better. Hands down, it's going to be better. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the carnivore diet isn't optimal just because you got an improvement in your digestion. Or when you go on low carb, you lose like 5 to 10 pounds of water weight and glycogen in the first week. It doesn't mean it's the best weight loss diet available. It just means you lost 5 to 10 pounds of glycogen and probably like cut out a bunch of garbage from your diet.
Yeah.
It's like, so it's not necessarily that carbs were the problem. But there's like a bunch of other things that people change, and they conflate it with just the one element that gets pushed in that sphere or that dogma.
I think my audience is like kind of knowledgeable enough to talk about this, because I think it's like really interesting, because once you know about thyroid, it's like makes more sense why things start to break down. But just like, can you explain like thyroid in general? Like, you have the T4 hormone that needs to go into the T3 for it to work. And I know a lot of people that are on like strictly T4 therapy and it doesn't really work for them. And I don't know, I just feel like it's like, you don't need a doctor to like help you with this stuff. And like, I know that's why a lot of people are going to like alternative routes for coaching or just like experimenting on their own. But what do you think like the best way is just in general to, I don't know, kind of learn about thyroid, or just like kind of, I don't know, just like a brief explanation on like where things go awry in the process?
Yeah. So to be fair, I can't tell people to not go to a doctor because it's like there's definitely some liability elements on there. So
Okay. This isn't medical advice.
I personally can't say that, especially because I do have a nursing license, so it's out of my scope to overstep like somebody with a medical license. But in terms of describing the thyroid pathways, I get part of the problem is and I can see why you would say like it's difficult to find a doctor that would help you to dial in the thyroid stuff, is a lot of doctors will just look at TSH. And TSH is a hormone that comes from the brain and goes to the thyroid gland, and it tells the thyroid gland to make thyroid hormone. And so the doctors will only test the TSH and say, oh, your TSH is low, so you must have enough thyroid hormone. But there's a lot of things that can affect the hypothalamic sensitivity to TSH. And then that also tells you nothing about what's going on with your active thyroid hormone. So the active thyroid hormone is T3. The inactive thyroid hormone, or storage hormone, I guess is an easy way to call it, would be T4. And the body converts T4 into T3. And so what determines that conversion is, number one, what's going on in the liver, because the liver is one of the largest areas where that conversion occurs, and also what's going on at the cell. So there's different types of enzymes. They're called deiodinase enzymes, and they convert T4 into T3, or they can convert into reverse T3. And so reverse T3 actually has no significant like metabolic raising effect. And in fact, it could possibly be anti-metabolic. Even if it's just shunting all of your storage thyroid hormone into an inactive form, it's anti-metabolic, like indirectly through that mechanism. And so what winds up happening is you want to look at this full profile and say, what's going on with TSH, what's going on with T4 and T3 production, and what's going on with the reverse T3. And so the TSH tells you, is the brain sensing enough, or is there something could be modulating what's going on with TSH production? Then you have the production from the thyroid gland, which is largely T4, but there is also some T3, and you have conversion into T3, and then or to reverse T3. So you want to really look at this full picture so that you can see, do I have enough active thyroid hormone in my system? And is my thyroid making it appropriately? And is my brain like having to really send signals to stimulate my thyroid gland to make this thyroid hormone, because there isn't enough? So there's multiple levels to actually understand in terms of what's going on. And the other thing that's kind of annoying is that different hormones and immune signaling molecules like cytokines will adjust the sensitivity of the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland to TSH feedback, to the negative feedback for TSH. And so if you have stress, or you have metabolic stuff or immune stuff going on, it can lower your thyroid hormone without necessarily, and it will look like you're actually normal thyroid because of this change of signaling at the pituitary and hypothalamus axis. So that becomes quite problematic in terms of just interpreting something off of TSH. And the other piece I want to put in here is you have the lab testing, but then you also have your symptom profile, and then like your actual metabolic function, which is why pulse and temp is something that's mentioned by Dr. Peat. And Dr. Peat actually got this from an MD PhD who specialized in thyroid function, Dr. Broda Barnes. He was big on testing pulse and temp, specifically the temperature, because thyroid hormone is one of the major regulators of your thermal regulation. I think every like the increase in degree of body temp is like some significant % increase in metabolism. So, when you're seeing your body temp increase, unless it's under the influence of stress, which is why they're looking at pulse. You're generally seeing an increase in your body's resting metabolism, which is a proxy marker for your thyroid function, your metabolic rate, and then also symptom profile, right? So like even if your TSH is low, say it's less than 1, but you're still constipated, you still have cold hands and feet, you still have anxiety, you still have insomnia, then it's like, yeah, I mean, let's look at the other markers. Like, let's look at these other pictures because it doesn't sound like your thyroid function is dialed in effectively. And so there's like a triangulation, at least that I look at when I'm working with a client to understand what's going on with their thyroid functions. Like, where's your lab values at? Where's your symptom profile at? Where's your pulse and temp at? And then I guess, I mean, there's another area, but it's like, where are you coming from? What's your context? And so there's multiple factors to make a determination and say like, what's going on with metabolism, what's going on with thyroid function. That becomes important to actually get a sense besides just like, oh yeah, your TSH is in range, you're good to go. The other thing I want to mention briefly is ranges oftentimes are not really helpful. It's like if it's in range or out of range is kind of an irrelevant question. A lot of times the question is, where are you in range? So I'll be looking at different factors in terms of the quartiles in range. So the bottom 25%, top 25%, and then like the middle 50%, getting a sense of where somebody is, because that tells me where, especially on a trend, where's thyroid function moving. So trends are also really important to see, like, was your TSH just 10 and now it's at 4? It's like, that is a nice improvement. Whereas if you just saw 4, you'd be like, well, this isn't really a good thyroid function. This is actually pretty bad overall, indicating like leaning towards a subclinical hypothyroid state. So you also want to understand trends. So there's multiple factors integrating on the system. There's looking at the labs, there's looking at the symptoms, and there's looking at pulse and temp and history to get a full picture on what's going on with somebody's metabolism and thyroid function overall.
It's also, I think, the actual range. I'm pretty sure I've heard Dr. Peat say that it was created with like the iodine test or whatever, and they made it like the top. Or so at the time they said only 5% of people had hypothyroidism, and then they just kept it at that range of whatever now TSH was. So it was essentially a faulty range. And I mean, I remember I had 300 testosterone when I was low carbing, and they were telling me that was fine as well. So I think it's just like, if you're not, I mean, as a male, if you're not like getting up and you're like feeling like you have some motivation, it's probably, I mean, stemming from like a low testosterone state. And, it's not just that you're lazy, or I think that's one of the things I got from your podcast is like, it's not like a character fault that you don't have energy and you feel like crap and don't want to go to the gym. This is like an actual biological thing that's shifting you into like a higher stress state, which is making you not want to, do certain things that you probably know you should. And I don't know, just in general, like, how do you see that with like the thyroid kind of, isn't it like kind of in opposition to cortisol and like the stress state in general?
Yeah. So there's a couple pieces, because you mentioned quite a few things there.
Sorry, I just go on
No,
tangents.
it's perfectly fine. I just want to make sure that I respond to like different elements. Yeah. So the TSH range, they actually used to go up, I think like over 8 or around like up to 10 or around 8, and they actually dropped it down to 4. And then even there's some research now showing that like ideally less than 2. So there's like the ranges are shifting in that perspective, and they're looking at that in terms of like cardiovascular outcomes and different elements. We're like, oh, maybe this range should be a little bit different. So they are like adapting and shifting it. It's just kind of slow. Can I
ask you something about the TSH real quick?
Sure, go ahead.
Isn't it also too that like when you take T4, it can go down, but then it's not, I mean, I guess you kind of alluded to that, but like just the TSH in general isn't a good marker, because like you said, like things like stress can put it down. But like, what exactly is it like telling? Like, it's something with the pituitary or whatever, but why does it go up in a state of like low thyroid?
Because in the state of low thyroid, the pituitary gland is trying to tell the thyroid to make more thyroid hormone, because TSH acts on the thyroid to increase the production of thyroid hormone. So it starts to induce like different gene segments to produce different enzymes that will help to produce thyroid hormone, like thyroid peroxidase, which it will add, I think, some of the iodine groups onto tyrosine molecules on the thyroglobulin. And so this basically, when your brain is sensing like, I don't have enough thyroid hormone, it starts to say, it starts to create TSH to tell the thyroid like, yo, what's going on, man? Like, produce more thyroid hormone. This is not acceptable. And then it induces that thyroid hormone production. But the problem with that is that the TSH is also like inflammatory to the thyroid gland. So what you really want is you want the thyroid producing adequate thyroid hormone without having to have this elevated TSH response. Because the elevated TSH response is essentially saying to somebody interpreting the test, like, hey, there's something going on at the thyroid that's not ideal that we need to correct. So that could be nutrient problems. That could be stress hormone interaction. That could be toxicity. That could be something dealing with the microbiome. It could be autoimmune function or autoimmune things like the TPO antibodies, are essentially antibodies created by the immune system targeting that TPO enzyme that can be affecting its function. And so it's like you need, with the different things going on, it's important to kind of like address what that element is. But the TSH in general is saying like, hey, there's the thyroid function's impaired and we're trying to increase its function. But it also is the TSH can be inflammatory on the thyroid gland as well, which is why in autoimmune thyroid states, they actually will give some replacement to kind of take the pressure off the thyroid gland, especially if thyroid hormone levels are low as well, like T3 and T4.
Just in general, why is, I know kind of like T3 is like kind of like demonized, but it seems like if someone wasn't making the conversion, they would want the active hormone, because you're saying that the T4 goes to reverse T3, which would oppose T3. So why is that never recommended? And I don't know, just like kind of how does that work just in general, T3?
I think there's fear inside the medical community, like the traditional medical community, around like too much T3 being too stimulating on the cardiovascular system for some people, and then like leading to cardiovascular events. And I think that may be a function of like some of the education that they get with the different hormone. And then I know in postmenopausal women, there's a worry about like having TSH or too low and thyroid hormones being too high and that affecting bone mass. But I think in the studies I was looking at in premenopausal women where they had adequate estradiol and progesterone, you're not seeing that negative effect of like dialing in thyroid function on bone mass. And it's because I think in the postmenopausal state, you actually don't have these different sex steroids that have a trophic effect on the bones. And then if you push thyroid too heavy, you start to increase bone turnover. And then in that state, you already have a high bone turnover, but it's shifted more towards the degradation of bone through the osteoclast without an adequate increase of bone deposition from the osteoblast. So there's like things like this that the doctors are worrying about. I think part of that is related to like what the education is inside the system, and then there's also like a belief, or like essentially even when I was in school to be a nurse practitioner, they would say things like, if we had modules on treating people for hypothyroidism, and it's basically like, yeah, we just use Synthroid and then we lower TSH, and then once TSH is in this particular range, then this person's good to go, like they're not hypothyroid anymore. And there wasn't really any more education after that on dialing in T3 levels or looking at reverse T3. Like there's not even really a conversation on that area. And so for a lot of practitioners, unless they're maybe like specialized in endocrinology, they're not really going to get that much information around these specific nuances, especially like when you have primary care practitioners, physician's assistants, nurse practitioners, and then doctors. A lot of times they'll want to refer to the specialists because they can't, I think, again, I can't speak for all of them because I didn't go through medical school or physician assistant schooling. I was in the nurse practitioner program, but there's like, you get this broad overview of different disease processes and like the ways that they treat them. So it's like, this is the disease process, this is the symptom profile that you have, this is kind of what's going on, and then here's how we treat this and why. Instead of like a critical thinking process into each system and some unifying overview in the education for you to fully understand things. It's more like a system of categorization of symptoms, this testing, this disease, this treatment process. So there's not like this overarching element to it or this big lens. It's like, again, it's like reductionistic memorization pathways where this is this and this is that and this is that. And then like I think really good practitioners actually understand why you have these different problems going on in some of these different states. But I think there's also a large portion of practitioners that just know like this is that and that is this. Mm-hmm. And without really any further in-depth understanding of, oh, why is this that and why is this? Why are we seeing this symptom profile in this specific disease process? I think that's like another layer. And, I think there's probably a bell curve to some extent of where like a very small percentage really gets it. Most people kind of get it and know like what they need to know to get by for their clinical practice. And then there's a portion that just like has no idea what they're doing. So I think that would be fair to say for pretty much any area. But again, I think a lot of it is probably coming down to like the schooling around these things, and less so, like the practitioners are inherently deficient. Like this is the information they're exposed to. And the other thing is when you get into the medical field, like you have to see tons and tons of patients on a regular basis. And it's like, you don't really have that time to go and like fully research this other area. It's like when you come out of school, you have your data set and you have your information and you have your treatment pathways. And then when you're in like a residency or a fellowship or whatever the things are, like you learn these different skills and how these other practitioners are going about it from in this area. But there, once you're done with that, like I think a lot of time gets dedicated specifically towards like I have to see a certain number of patients and I have to deal with insurance billing and then I have to follow clinical pathways set by the research institutions and the pharmaceutical companies. And so there's a lot of pressures on the practitioners, like where they can't really deviate from the education and from the systems that are set in place. And I guess there's a perspective where you could say like, oh, this kind of makes sense because we want to have some standardized protocols that we run through a different circumstance, but that depends on how good those protocols actually are. And so if you start questioning different protocols, again, I'm not saying that I am or I'm not, but if you start questioning different protocols, like you start ruffling feathers because you're questioning like entrenched authority systems that people are relying on. And then if they have to shift all of that, it's like quite a cognitive dissonance. And also like it creates, I think, some mistrust in some areas because people start questioning other areas and protocols of the system as well.
Mm. It just seems like a system that's not really geared, like you said, like towards like the individual's needs as much as it's just, you said like lowering the TSH, even though it might not actually fix anything. It just kind of gets them off like, you got your TSH low, now you're good.
Yeah.
I think I was asking this before, but I kind of cut you off. But just how like low thyroid and cortisol, or how like thyroid and cortisol like kind of are like kind of like the relationship between the two and how like one might, lower the other, vice versa.
Yeah. So if you're under chronic stress, I think the increases in cortisol and the stress hormones in general, depending on the context, will start to lower thyroid hormone function. Essentially, the way you can contextualize this, or at least the way that I contextualize it, is that when you're under stress and you're having to rely on these different hormones to liberate substrate, whether that's glucose or fatty acids from like breaking down your protein tissues or breaking down your glycogen, you get into this circumstance where your basically your body's saying like, we don't want to push the gas pedal on metabolism here because it's going to create, we're breaking down our tissues in order to provide substrate. So in that context, you can have this change in or lowering of thyroid function under the influence of stress hormones, which is usually a combination of cortisol, adrenaline, glucagon, growth hormone, prolactin. They kind of all go together in that stress system. So that can be from like, this is important, is the way you see stress is you either have a lack of energy supply. So you're fasting, you're on a low calorie diet, you're on a low carbohydrate diet. All of those will drive those other hormones. Or you have an excessive energy demand. So that's, you got an injury, you got burned, you got, I don't know, you have metabolic dysfunction and immune dysregulation going on that would create a higher energy demand. Or that could also create a lower energy supply because of actual damage in the ability to adequately produce energy or use substrate. And so in these circumstances, stress hormones are increasing to like manage these systems. but they can also contribute to creating problems in these systems as well, as they're chronically upregulated, because the stress hormones come at a cost. So some of those costs are lowering metabolism, like lowering thyroid hormone function, but it's in response to the state. So it's like the state that the body is functioning under starts to increase these signaling molecules that are the stress hormones that say, hey, like we have this problem going on and we're going to try to solve it through these backup pathways. But those backup pathways start to come at a cost. And it's like, okay, we're shredding our muscle tissue because we don't have enough carbohydrate coming in and enough substrate coming in so that we have enough energy on board. So we need to lower the metabolic rate. And then it's like, after you shred enough muscle tissue or protein tissue, it's like now you're losing lean mass. And now you're losing connective tissue. And now you're losing bone mass. And now you're causing issues with your brain when you're under the extreme influence of cortisol. So in acute circumstances, the stress hormones are absolutely life-saving. But in chronic long-term upregulations of the stress hormones, you're basically just, it's a slow degradatory process. It's a slow death, basically.
I was going to ask you kind of like, how do you like look at research itself? Because I know like a lot of the papers in general just like say something, but then if you actually read it, it doesn't back it up, or like it says something, but it's like, oh, well, I agree with that, but not the full premise. So how do you yourself like do research, since like that's kind of like how you like base everything right now is kind of, I'm not just going to take what the medical establishment is saying. I'm going to read it myself.
So I think the first thing for me, so first you have this like overarching framework that you can filter the research through, right? So that's why initially Dr. Peat's framework was extremely helpful for me, because it allowed me to have an overarching picture that I could start to refine. It essentially, you can see it as it gave me the block of granite that I could slowly whittle down into this like Greek statue, right? So you start with something instead of starting with nothing. Mm-hmm. If you start with nothing, it's a lot harder because you have to get something first, and then you can start to refine it. And so having this, and this is like the idea that I think even Dr. Peat alluded to, but something that Dr. Buckminster Fuller referred to as like standing on the shoulders of giants. So you have these other great individuals' work that you can start to read, and initially you get a sense of how things are going on. And like at first you're going to have to adopt a perspective. And then you kind of work through that perspective in real life, and you start to figure out what works, what doesn't, maybe some things you agree with, some things you disagree with. And then but you have this thing that you're working with, and you start to build out this overarching framework, and then you can filter different information through that framework. So for me, I started with, I had other frameworks established, but when I found Dr. Peat's work, it gave me a more complete, unifying framework that was extremely helpful as a good starting place to start to understand things better. And so I started with that. And then when I would read the research papers, instead of just reading the information saying, oh, this is fact, it was like, I read the information, I actually take the time to think about it and to process it and say like, well, what does this actually mean in real life? How can I relate this into what I'm doing and what I've experienced? How does this fit into my overarching mental framework and picture that I'm viewing with things? And then is there some part of my picture that is incongruent with this new piece of information? And how does that have to adjust? And then how does that ripple across the whole framework? So I'm constantly, people tend to think, and I think you see this in the sphere, like a lot of guys get flack, these big influencers, which they come out with a perspective of like, keto is it. It's keto, it's plant-based, or it's animal-based, it's carnivore, and that's the final answer. And I think for me, I don't come at things that way, and perhaps it doesn't sell as well, and perhaps it's irritating to some people because they just want an answer. But that's because as I go through the process, like number one, I learn like there's way more I need to learn. There's way more I need to know. And then number two, it's like I'm constantly adjusting this framework and learning new things and integrating into the framework. So when I'm reading the research, filtering it through, making adjustments, tweaking, trying to build out more and more understanding as I go along the way, instead of this is the de facto thing. Oh, now all of this is wrong and I'm going to go to this. It's like a progression instead of you're like move. If you think of a graph, if you think of a line, you're progressing upward and increasing some things. Maybe it's not like a completely straight trajectory. There's some ups and downs as you go along, but you're kind of developing and learning along the way, instead of everything I learned here is completely wrong, so I'm going to go on this complete opposite direction and reject everything. For me, there's this lack of rejection. And so like different diets, that's why, I take things from keto. I take things I learned from carnivore, from paleo, from plant-based, from bodybuilding, from bioenergetics. And I start to keep the pieces that worked for me and that I saw value in, synthesize them, create something together, and then move forward. And so the benefit of this with the research is that I'm able to discern different elements pretty well. And it also, I guess, when I read a research paper, number one, it takes me a long time to get through some papers sometimes, because I'm trying to understand like what is this writer of the paper thinking about when they're writing this paper. What is their premise that they're arguing from, which they usually will set up in their introductory statements, and then try and understand how they arrange things, and then what their conclusions were, and what the results were. So like you can look at the results and say like, this is what the graphs show. And then I also have my separate interpretation from what they actually interpreted. And then I'm also getting a sense of what context and perspective are they coming from, and filtering that through my own framework that I had set up. And also the other thing is, I guess for me, and this is difficult, is like, I'm not tied to what I think. It's not attached particularly to my identity as like, this is like this thing that I believe is who I am. It's more a process of, this is a belief that I hold. Is there some information that will challenge this and let me know that I need to adjust it? It doesn't have to wholesale be wrong, but there could be like 5% of it that wasn't dialed in effectively. And if I'm presented with the right information that helps me to see it better, then I can say, okay, I'm going to change this 5% of the idea and shift in this direction and make progress with it over time. So that's how I personally approach the research. And I also, like, again, I don't start out as like, there's this hierarchy of evidence and this meta-analysis is absolutely fact. And I just need to base my whole life and like figure out how to tie my shoes based on Cochrane studies and stuff like this. Like that's not the perspective. It's like, taking in multiple pieces of information from different areas of my life and trying to weave things together to understand what's going on. So it's really a process like, what's going on? Like why is this happening? Why is that happening? What happens if I do this? What happens if I do that? And then taking the feedback and adjusting from there, and then using research and theories to try to get a better understanding of things. And it's, a large part of it is even to improve my own life, because I also have had my own significant health issues, and then also to help other people and see like, oh, I don't have endometriosis or PCOS. So I don't know what it feels like to have heavy bleeding every month or something like this. But I also can look in the research and understand like, well, what's going on? What are the mechanisms? What's this person experiencing? And then parse those things together as well. So I think the goal-directed element of it, the lack of attachment to my ego of like, this belief system is who I am, having a framework and then being able to discern, and also trying to understand the writer's perspective and their framework that they're working with is helpful for me to be able to parse things out effectively.
Has there been anything like since the beginning of switching to like bioenergetic style diet? I mean, obviously things have changed, but like in the last like few years that is like really stands out to you as something that like maybe you found on your own that's just like really worked well for you, or that you've changed and has like really like benefited you?
Yeah. So when there's like, it wasn't like there's like one thing. There's like a variety of small things that I did that added up cumulatively to have the benefit. But I guess one of the big ones for me is, I guess this was even more of a mental framework or mindset shift, where I came to the perspective that I need to go with things that work for me in real life. So if I test something out consistently and I get this consistent response, regardless of whatever this authority figure is saying to me, this researcher or this guru, if it doesn't work for me, then I'm going to need to figure out why it's not working for me, and then just keep it out. So like one of those for me was dairy. And again, like I'm not saying Dr. Peat was saying that everybody should have dairy, but it was like dairy was something that was like pretty highly touted in the sphere, and I don't tolerate it very well. Now, do I think that means that everybody else can't have dairy? No, it's just for my specific context, for what's going on with my gut, with my history, with like the surgery I had, with my health stuff, with my genetic background, with what's going on in my microbiome, my digestive function, all this type of stuff. I just don't tolerate it well. And so when I took that out and I was like, all right, fine, I'm going to give it up. It's not working for me. Like, let's just see what happens. And then I felt significantly better. Then I was like, okay, like I need to, like, this isn't going to work for me. So then I had to look for other options, obviously, to like manage calcium, the phosphorus and whatnot. But to be fair, I did empirically try to make it work in like 50 different types of ways. So like grass-fed milk, store-bought milk, ultra homogenized, high temperature treated milk, raw milk, camel milk, goat milk, kefir, yogurt, all types of cheeses, like just in all these different ways. And then basically I settled as like, I do pretty well with whey protein. Mm-hmm. And then that's pretty much it. And so I was like, okay, I'll like incorporate this one piece. And then I was like figuring out why it didn't work for me. And so like that was something, it wasn't necessarily like that the dairy was the biggest thing. I mean, it made a difference in my health not having it, but it was this idea that I needed to figure out what was specifically working for me and then go from there and like kind of test it out to see the results in real life instead of trying to rely specifically on what some other outside authority was saying that doesn't have any understanding of my personal context.
Mm-hmm. We were talking about this before, but just like the ability to work and like not feel as fatigued now that you're doing this kind of diet. So what is like beyond that, like what else have you noticed has like been like, has there anything that's like changed like so dramatically since you started? Like just in like your lifestyle in general or just like how you interact with people?
Yeah. So with the productivity piece, a big one that was massively helpful for me was figuring out that I didn't do that well with starches. And so, when I first transitioned from paleo, low carb, keto, intermittent fasting, all that sphere was, and into the bioenergetic sphere, I wouldn't eat fructose because I thought fructose at that point in time was like pure poison. It's going to make me fat. I was shredded from being low carb and working out and stuff. So I was like, I don't want to lose my abs. I don't want to get fat. I don't want to, all this type of stuff. And then, so I wouldn't have the orange juice. I wouldn't have sugar. And so like I would try to meet my dietary carb intake at first with potatoes and plantains and white rice. And I don't really do that well with starches. So after I would eat them, I'd get sluggish and I would get tired and like the plantains would bloat me up. I didn't really tolerate them well. And so I was trying to do the carb stuff and it was just with the glucose sources. And then I was like having a really hard time. And then for a while I was like, maybe I just don't do well with carbs. And then I finally was like, I told myself, I was like, let me just give it like 2 weeks or a month with the sugars. If it doesn't work out well, I could always just stop. That's not a problem. And I know how to, get shredded again. Like, I don't think I'll have a hard time. So I gave it 2 weeks to a month and I went full bore into sugars. And it was like orange juice at first. And then I started having like honey and maple syrup and granulated sugar. And then I started to realize, wow, I was still doing some of the starches. But then I like did an experiment. I took it one step further and I took out all the starches and just tried the sugars. And it's like, wow, my mental function is so much better. Like I'm not getting sluggish after meals. I'm not like my digestion is way better overall. My workouts are better. I'm not getting like this joint stiffness because the plantains were giving me quite a bit of joint stiffness. And that was like huge for my cognitive function because then I was able to actually have consistent cognitive function throughout the day without having these huge peaks and valleys. And then my productivity got way better after that. And then I decided that like maybe I should just have all sugars and I dropped my fat too low. And then I developed other problems because that just goes with the experimentation. And at least for me, like I start thinking about an idea and then I just like can't not try it out. Yeah. So that happened. And then eventually I also figured out that a lot of refined sugars were really problematic for me. Like it was ruining my teeth and things like this. So I switched over to like whole fruits, dried fruit, frozen fruit, fresh fruit, and then fruit juices. And I had those in the context of meal. And then I stopped having the oral health issues I was having. And I just felt better overall. My nutrient status was better. My energy was better. My digestion improved. So those were also changes as well. So like it's all these little changes from experimenting, but the starch versus sugar thing and the dairy components were huge for my productivity and for my function on a regular basis. That, you know, and I keep trying starches because I know it's like it makes my life a little bit easier. But every time I try it, like it's pretty significant difference versus when I just have sugar-based carbohydrates from fruits.
Is there anything else, Mike, you think I missed? Or what do you think for people that are kind of on the fence? Like, what is the final straw to try carbs again? Is it just that they taste good and they need to try them again? Just because, I mean, I think it's funny though, like the whole like idea that you wouldn't eat something that, you know, because it tastes good, or like you want to suppress your appetite in general. But sorry, I'm just free balling. But
no worries. It's like I feel like that stems from like this like puritanic original sin perspective, like a traditional underpinning of Western society where you're like your natural inclinations are inherently evil and you have to constantly suppress them. I think that to be fair, it doesn't push me all the way into like the perspective that we see now where everything is subjective. Cause I think there are some like overall objective truths based on different contexts. But I think the idea that like our inclinations are inherently bad is something that I kind of had to shun myself or like shift in general. Is like there needs to be an element of control, but not, I think, an outright sense of rejection. And I think the element of control is related to like some of the situations we find ourselves in society. So like a lot of the food choices that people would crave are highly problematic. And I don't think that it's just that they're craving bad foods. It's like they're craving things in those foods like fats or salt or sugar to help lower their stress. But the food industry has just done a really good job at figuring out what drives human cravings and then making foods that support that. So it's not that you need to outright reject your cravings or these different food groups. It's more so that you need to exercise a level of control in which foods you're using to actually dial in those cravings effectively and like go about it in an intelligent manner. So I think that's a big one, is like this need to like something needs to be negative for it to be good to you, or you need to like suffer through it. I think mentality isn't necessarily true. And then the other thing I would say is with a lot of this stuff, the self-experimentation is absolutely key. And so if somebody is on a low carb diet and they're like, oh, should I try carbs? Should I not try carbs? A week of trying something or 2 weeks of trying something over the like course of your lifespan is relatively irrelevant. So if you spent like a week or 2 weeks saying, I'm just going to try adding in some whole fruit in my diet and see how it goes. If you think after the 2 week time frame, if you're like, this was an absolutely terrible experiment, then just stop. And it's not going to make a difference to all like being on your low carb diet or whatever the thing was when you revert back. So for me, that was a big component in a way that I was able to get myself around these cognitive hangups about, if I eat oranges today, I'm going to ruin all the progress I made for the past 5 years of fasting and low carb. And it's like, yeah, that's not reality. So like you can have your like 2 mandarin oranges and see how it goes for a couple days.
Yeah.
And then, you know, if it doesn't work out, then just kind of stop and go back to where it was, or like use the information and make a new perspective. So I think this idea of like taking your actual experience in your own life, testing things out, giving yourself the latitude to see how things go is the easiest way to get over these hangups that people have about trying carbohydrates or trying these different approaches. And then the other thing I would say is, I have this with a lot of clients where they're like, you know, how do you know what, you know, this doctor says that, and this guru says this, and this authority says this, and they're all different and they're all competing and everybody thinks they're right. And for me, the same way that I was able to get over the like trying the different things is be like, yeah, I'm not going to figure out what's right or what's wrong by listening to all these people talk. I'm going to have to actually make a logical plan, like a rational plan, put it into action, take feedback from the results I get, and then adjust from there. Because, you know, Robert Lustig says this and Peter Attia says that. And, you know, Caldwell Ethelston or whatever his name is, like says this, and Paul Saladino says that, and they're all like conflicting. So what do I do? And Ray Peat says this, and people are like juggling all of these gurus in their mind. And it's just like, well, what do you want? Like, what are you trying to see? Are you trying to see if carbs are going to be problematic? Okay. Say, okay, I'm going to add carbs in and then test it out and then gauge your feedback from there. And because you're going to, for me, I spent a lot of time spinning my wheels trying to read papers to get perfect answers on things, on how something was going to specifically work out for me. And it's hard to, or like listening to somebody else's experience or some other guru. And so I could take those things into consideration as I formulated the experiment that I was going to run on myself, and then try to be objective about the result and give it a specific time period instead of trying to just like, read all this stuff and listen to all these podcasts to figure out what was going to work for me. So that was a huge, that was massive benefit to me overall. But I know I'm going on a lot here, but the last piece that I'd say to be careful of is to really try to make your decisions from a rational perspective as best as possible. I know if you're not feeling well, it's really difficult, but to try to step back and say, is this like one meal a day, 500 calorie diet while I trek across the United States a good idea? And it's like, probably not. Mm-hmm. Like, that's probably not a good idea. So make sure that the thing that you're deciding to embark on has a very, consider the risk versus reward. Consider what's the benefits that this person is marketing to you, and then what are the actual risks of this circumstance through your own life experience and through some of the things that you are thinking are going on. Because I think people can easily be sold by kind of like sophist arguments where they sound good logically, but they're like, if you actually looked at them from an overarching perspective objectively, you'd be like, what is this guy talking about? Mm-hmm. So I think those types of things it's important to consider that at all times. And for me, that comes from me doing really stupid stuff to myself and harming myself, and then looking back at it and being like, yeah, why did I do that?
Yeah. That's one of the things I've noticed is just in general, like the people that sometimes don't care about their health and they're just a lot happier, and they don't worry. They just eat when they're hungry and then stop when they're full, and they don't worry about seed oils, and they're like somewhat healthy. And that's like the whole thing is like, we would just be healthy if you could go out to a restaurant and not be poisoned. So it's like kind of hard because everything around you is putting you in a state of like illness and like authoritarian kind of perspective, which is also one of the reasons why like your guys' podcast is talking about like the reason why we're in this state. Like, it's not that we're inherently like bad and we're just meant to get sick. It's like there's certain stuff in the environment that's you might have to tinker with a little bit, but then once you do and you realize you feel a lot better and you have a higher quality of life, you might as well keep doing it.
That's said pretty well. I think the modern environment and constraints that we find ourselves in, it's like it requires us to actually have more thought about what we're eating, versus because particularly Western culture is pretty sick. Whereas when I was in Portugal for a little while, and the traditional diet there, like the way that people eat on average, like if you go to a restaurant, it's grilled fish, a glass of fresh squeezed orange juice, they put some olives out beforehand, and there's a boiled carrots, boiled potatoes, just like comes with the meal. And to a large, like that general meal, like that's a typical dish, that's a typical food. And that culture there is set up to that like promotes health because of the mentality, the types of foods that are eaten, etc. And there's obviously some other areas in the culture that you could maybe say are problematic in different perspectives outside of health, but in multiple different areas. But like a culture like that promotes it, whereas in the Western culture around health is kind of like ridiculous. And somebody can argue with me about it, I guess. But then when you look at the outcomes at the end of the day and you compare them between some of these different countries, you can see like, yeah, the Western outcomes for health, considering the amount of resources that are actually spent and the outcomes that we get, are pretty atrocious. And I don't think that it's just because the medical care system is, heavily corporatized compared to other areas. It's also the general idea around health in Western cultures at large, particularly the US, which is what I'm most familiar with, is pretty poor. There's this idea that like what you eat doesn't have an effect on you and it doesn't matter. And all your problems are like genetically or largely genetic in origin. And we just have to manage them through some type of pharmaceutical or surgical manipulation. And then we'll manage them to give you like this, a relative length of life, but your quality, we're not going to ask about quality of life. And so, and then there's like a lack of self-responsibility on the individual as well to try to troubleshoot what's going on with their health. There's a lot of outsourcing to some authority whose interest in your well-being is questionable. And so that basic premise inside the culture, I think, creates huge problems. And so that's precipitating people needing to actually figure out systems for themselves and to actually spend a lot of time, energy, money, and resources to figure out like how am I going to feel well and function well? And that is something that I think that's a product of the current context compared to like previous contextual timeframes.
Yeah, it's just a complete different breed now with people like being child's getting like fatty liver when they're, or like diabetes. It's like pretty insane to think about, like it wasn't even a thing like 100 years ago and now.
Yeah.
But like, it's just like such a priority because, once you get into that state, it's like hard to break out of it. Kind of to talk about like Pete's work, but that's kind of like, once you're in the like higher serotonin state, it makes it hard to like really question things and want to, like, that's the thing, like I was saying before about him being like a certain, him having like a certain like guideline, like a guiding principle. It's like to be like a child or have like the metabolism of a child. So it's like you want to be playful and doing exploratory work or whatever. So it really goes through like all parts of life.
Yeah. That's the internal locus of control is, I think, an extremely important element. Self-responsibility is an extremely important element, and obviously, and then these things are not promoted in the culture as well, right? I mean, you spend 20 something years of your life where you're outsourcing your development of knowledge and understanding of reality by being put behind a desk and listening to some authority who follows a particular curriculum that was created by some outside regulating body, and like that they are your purveyors of truth instead of people taking a critical perspective. And there's all this lip service to critical thinking, and it's like, yeah, where's the critical thinking? Where are people actually being promoted to actually think about things in a critical fashion instead of wholesale accept whatever ideology they're being sold? And so I think there's like problems in multiple systemic levels inside the current Western culture that's driving a lot of these issues and precipitating the production of these kind of like external systems to what's going on. And I think the biggest thing is that people just aren't getting the outcomes they want from these existing systems. So they're like, people aren't dumb. People will see like this isn't working, and then they'll go and try to find another solution inherently, regardless of what everyone says about humanity. It's like humanity will troubleshoot. Humanity will figure out what the next thing is going to be, regardless of whatever some agenda is going to be. They may get derailed for a time while they're, trying to traverse this minefield of alternative information, because there's, as far as like what's, the truth or this marketing angle, those types of things are shrouding people trying to like actually help themselves. There's a lot of components to dial in there, and then there's a lot of elements that an individual has to learn to be able to discern effectively. So yeah, again, it's not that the whole thing is completely terrible. Like in terms of infective disease processes, in terms of traumatic injuries and things like this, like the Western healthcare is great. It's just when it comes to chronic disease processes, the ideas around it, which the vast majority of the population is dealing with, is like, yeah, the stuff is not really working that well. And then the way it's not even what they're doing. It's how they think about it, how they go about it, how they're addressing these things is just such a low level of thought process and low level of development that what comes after in terms of what is done is like, it's just not really working because how it's being thought about is pretty poor. And so once that changes, once that perspective changes, and that's, something you see with Pete, the overall perspective changes, then you start to see, oh, wow, there's actually real solutions. But if you create these these barricades or these walls in terms of how you're supposed to think about something, and you can't think outside of that, then you'll be stuck with like certain types of solutions. But when you can step outside of that and change the perspective and context of what you're looking at it, like these new and novel solutions that would have never been considered become like heavily available to you. And it's like, wow, this is so simple, or this is quite effective compared to all this other stuff that, you know, I've tried in the past. And that's where, like, again, Pete's work is revolutionary in that stuff. Not that every single thing he ever said is 100% right and you need to follow him as this like ultimate purveyor of authority and truth, but that how he thought about things, the level at which he viewed things and thought about things led to like drastically improved solutions because of that how or why he was thinking about things in the system and the lens and whatnot. And that's the revolutionary perspective. Whereas like even in the traditional alternative dietary spheres, how they think about things is pretty poor. It's like there's like a villainization of one element over another. It's like, oh, it's just plant foods, it's just animal foods, it's just carbs. And it's like such a simplistic way to view things that it's like, yeah, of course it's not going to be effective. If you're betting all your chips on the idea that carbs are just the major problem of all ills of modern man, it's like you're probably betting wrong. And so that's the same thing. It's like all animal products or all plant products or something like this. Like it's just, you know, it's a relatively rudimentary and crude perspective, I would say, to a large extent.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Mike, for coming on. I think everyone should just go to your podcast, listen to that, and get some good information there, but appreciate it. And where can I reach you? It's a good spot.
Yeah, awesome. I appreciate the invitation and the time. People can check me out at my website, mikefave.com. I have a free kind of course and guide talking about how to set up some of this dietary stuff in case somebody's interested in experimenting with anything. And they can also check me out at Mike Fave YouTube. And I have some new content coming out there, podcast and some really cool animated videos explaining some of these processes. And I think a little like terms that are more approachable for people who don't have a scientific background.
Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Sweet.
Thanks, Luke.